Welcome back here, 13s. I hope you and your families are keeping well, and I hope you've all had a restful half-term break. At the beginning of this video, I'm just going to be going over the Year 13 politics exams, as well as the lesson structure from now until the end of the summer holidays, as well as from the beginning of September. And then I'll outline an introduction to US politics. So, paper 1, UK politics and core political ideas. That will be the stuff that you studied in AS with Mr. Trudgeon, as well as the core political ideologies of conservatism, liberalism, and socialism. Component 2, UK government, is the stuff that you studied with me in AS in year 12, as well as the non-core political ideology of feminism. Paper 3 then will be comparative politics USA, which will be the government politics of the USA, as well as the need to draw comparisons between the different units covered in US politics, as well as the different units covered in UK politics. So all of the stuff that you covered in year 12. Each of these papers is worth a third of your whole A-level politics grade, and the lesson structure will be split between 6 lessons with me over the fortnight for US politics, as there's more content to cover, and 4 lessons over 2 weeks with Mr. Trudgeon from now until the summer holiday. So you can expect 1 more hour of work from me every fortnight and 1 less hour of work from Mr. Trudgeon every fortnight, in comparison to what you had before half term. Okay. Right, so comparative politics of the USA. So the government politics of the USA is as such, and the structure will be as follows. So constitution and federalism, so we'll be looking at the US Constitution and how a federalist system operates within the USA. We'll be looking at Congress, so the legislative branch of Congress, the presidency, so that is the executive branch. We'll be looking at the Supreme Court and civil rights, democracy and participation, and we'll also be looking at the comparative theory, so comparative theory such as the structural theory, rational theory, and cultural theory, okay? And what we'll be doing with these 3 comparative theories is drawing links, okay, between the US systems of government and politics, as well as the UK system of government and politics. And that will become clearer much further down in the course. The purpose of today, then, is an introduction to the unit. And the key question that we're sort of concerned with is, to what extent was the US founded on the basis of equality? Right. One of the key things to be aware of when studying US politics is the background behind the establishment of the US Constitution by the Founding Fathers. Now, the 13 colonies originally, which existed in the USA, so those are the 13 colonies portrayed on this slide. Those 13 colonies were primarily ruled by the British, okay? So the 13 colonies in America at the time, they were run by the British Empire, okay? So the British Empire and their purpose was to economically exploit these 13 colonies. By taking over these 13 colonies, the British sought to drain these colonies financially for their own benefit, okay? So we've got a number of ways in which the British seek to do this. So we've got 4 different acts here, okay? So we've got the 1765, the Stamp Act, which places a tax on all official documents in the colonies, such as newspapers. We've got the Quartering Act, which was an extra tax to cover the cost of keeping the British Army in America to protect the colonists, and what we mean by the colonists is the American people. In 1766, we've got the Stamp Act being repealed, but that is replaced by a Declaratory Act, which reinforces Parliament's right to pass laws for and levy taxes on the colonies. We've also got the Townshend Act in 1767, which puts and places new duties on different goods in the colonies, such as glass, paper, and tea. Okay. So what are these? Quite simply, these are acts of Parliament. Okay, these are acts of Parliament passed by British Parliament in Westminster, and in terms of what they're doing, their purpose is to ensure that the American people within those 13 colonies are paying tax. Okay, so the British are reaping economic benefits from these 13 colonies, as they're requiring the American people, the American colonists, to pay them tax. Okay. Now, what might the impact be, or why might they be considered unjust? Now, one of the reasons why they're considered unjust is, from the Americans' people's point of view, is the argument that they're required to pay taxes to the British, they're losing out economically, but they're not having a say in the governance of their own affairs, okay? They're not being represented in British Parliament, of course. So the Americans, they're angry because they feel they're being taxed without representation, okay? So there's this famous quote by James Otis who says, taxation without representation is tyranny, okay? So the American people, the American colonists, they're being taxed without being able to have a say in their own affairs, have a say in their own governance, as that is primarily being controlled by the British from Parliament in Westminster. Okay, so the debate over the British colonies. Now, what I will need you to do is read page 4, okay, and answer the questions in purple. Now, why was democracy limited? Now, this might be a challenging question. One of the reasons why democracy was limited, and you'll be able to gather this from here, is primarily because of the fact that there were property qualifications which people needed to pass in order for them to be able to vote. So, for example, women and African Americans, they were excluded from voting because they did not pass these property qualifications. Slavery was also common at the time. What purpose did the American colonies serve for the British? Now, one of the main things that we need to realize is that the British saw economic benefits here. The colonists were obliged to pay tax to the British, even though they had no representation at Westminster Parliament. So, as James Otis declared, taxation without representation is tyranny. It is cruel and oppressive for the British to essentially tax us as American people, as American colonists, without us having a say in our own affairs, without us being able to have a seat in British Parliament, to be able to have a say in our own governance, okay? That then leads to the War of Independence in 1775. So this then becomes inevitable because the British are trying to tighten their grip over the American colonies. They're trying to tax them a lot more heavily to ensure that they're able to reap economic benefits. And this becomes sort of arduous on the American people. And the American people have simply had enough. They're dissatisfied and discontent with British rule, and therefore they sort of seek an uprising, okay? And the first of these uprisings is, in fact, the Boston Massacre of 1770. A few people here are killed, about 5 people are killed, and about 6 are seriously injured, okay? Now, after the War of Independence in 1775 then, okay, there's the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July 1776. Now, the Declaration of Independence issued by these colonies declare themselves as free and independent states, in quotation marks. Okay. Now, as these 13 colonies become independent from the British, then there's something called the Declaration of Independence, and you will be able to explore that through the questions that you answer. One of the key things that I wanted to clarify was the Articles of Confederation. So the Articles of Confederation, this was a plan offered by Richard H. Lee, and he offered this plan of confederation after colonial rule had ended, after the British had left these 13 colonies. So the Articles of Confederation were ratified, which means sort of accepted by the 13 independent states by March 1781. Although hostilities with the British remained present until the Treaty of Paris in 1783. So essentially, the Articles of Confederation meant that these 13 states became independent from March 1781, but there were still hostilities, there was still no peace made with the British until the Treaty of Paris in 1783. 1883. Now, these Articles of Confederation, they declared or they introduced this idea of a confederacy, which meant that there were a number of sovereign independent states rather than a national government. Okay, so all of these 13 states, they were independent. Okay, and there was no sort of national government which bound them together. Okay, so this was a massive amount of decentralization. There was a central government which lacked significant powers. So the articles depicted, these Articles of Confederation, they depicted the government, the central government, as being weak. There was no executive branch, there was no president, and there was no judiciary or Supreme Court. The legislative branch was existent, but it was merely a forum for discussion. The textbook actually describes the legislative branch of government as just a talking shop. Okay, so no serious discussion, negotiation, or consensus actually took place in the legislature. Now, this was then problematic. Okay, and the reason why this is problematic is because there's many leaders of the Revolutionary War, such as George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, who argue that a strong central government was essential. Okay, particularly when the states argued over currency and commerce, and even the erection of trade barriers against each other. For an economy to grow, these trade barriers between the states would need to cease to exist. So the key thing here is that a central government was declared essential by Alexander Hamilton and George Washington to essentially even prevent these states, these 13 independent states now, from going to war with each other if issues and problems existed between them, because there's no central government to sort out and facilitate their problems or issues, to fix them, essentially. So what we have then is a second meeting called in Philadelphia. There was a first meeting in Maryland, but not many people turned up. So a second meeting was called in Philadelphia in May 1787 to revise the Articles of Confederation. Okay, this was soon to be scrapped, so the Articles were scrapped, and an entirely new constitution was to be formed. Now, the reason why the Articles of Confederation were scrapped was because they were weak and ineffective. Okay, problems were inevitable between these 13 independent states. Okay, because there was no central government. Now, the key thing here is that the American colonies, the 13 American colonies, they feared a ruler, a central government. They feared the appearance of a central government, a strong central government, who would act like the British did when they ruled. Okay, so the reason why they feared a strong central government is because they thought it'd just be a replica of the British Parliament, and that they would equally economically exploit all of those 13 colonies. So the founding fathers really had to strike a balance here. They needed to strike a balance, firstly, between the need for a strong central government, okay, to ensure that issues and problems between the states could be easily fixed. They also needed to ensure that states' rights and individuals' rights could be respected. Okay, so they had to find a sort of a compromise between both. Okay, so we've got the anti-federalists and we've got the federalists here. Now, the anti-federalists, they're against strong central government. They have concerns over a tyrannical executive power. Okay, so they didn't want a strong central government because they believed that a strong central government created after independence would simply represent the way in which the British ruled the 13 colonies before the American colonies gained their independence. They promoted states' rights. They feared the dominance of the elites, and they were often represented amongst the yeoman class. So those were those who were farmers primarily. Okay. On the other hand, we've got the Federalists. So despite the name, they emphasize the need for concerted, centralized government. Okay, strong government for them, such as Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, was essential. They did not want weakness of the Articles of Confederation to continue. Okay, they were generally supported in urban areas of the north, and they were concerned about the rule of the mob. So again, you'll be required to answer the questions in purple here. And this is quite nice because it just summarizes the arguments of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists and who exactly they were. Right. So the key thing, sort of to remember in relation to the introduction to U.S. politics, I'll just sum them up. Okay. The British ruled these 13 colonies. Okay. They ruled them for the purpose of economically exploiting those 13 colonies. Okay, they wanted to tax the American people as much as possible. The British wanted to tax the American people as much as possible to ensure that they gained the most from it financially and economically. The American people, they were dissatisfied and discontent with British rule because of the fact that they were being taxed really heavily without any representation for themselves. They were angry because they had no say in their own affairs. They had no say in self-government. Okay. As a result of that, revolution became inevitable. There was a War of Independence in 1775. Following the War of Independence, there was the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July, 1776. The Articles of Confederation were drawn up, whereby all of those 13 colonies became independent states. Okay, there was no strong national government. Okay, there was no strong central government at the time. And these Articles of Confederation in the Philadelphia Convention, then, they were considered weak as ineffective, as they would be unable to deal with any sort of problems or issues which came up between the states themselves, between these 13 colonies themselves. So the Federalists, they argued for a strong central government, okay, and this was primarily the discussion in the Philadelphia Convention, the second meeting called in Philadelphia in May 1787, where a constitution was then drawn up by 1789, okay, and the cornerstone of the forming of the US Constitution by the Founding Fathers is what we call the Connecticut Compromise, to ensure that a balance is struck between the need for a strong central government, but a strong central government which does not resemble the tyranny of the British before American independence, and the need to strike that balance with protecting states and individual rights. Okay, that was a Connecticut Compromise. Now, the Connecticut Compromise was two chambers of the legislative branch, so two chambers of Congress. There was to be the House of Representatives, and there was also to be the Senate. The Senate across the states would be equally elected, so each state would elect 2 senators. The House of Representatives, however, that was to be elected according to, well, they would elect as many members according to the population of that specific state. Okay, so to sum up and to answer our original question, to what extent was the US founded on the basis of equality? Well, in terms of gender, women were still unable to vote, okay, and they were unable to vote for a very long time. As a result of property qualifications, of course. The Declaration of Independence declared all men are created equal, in quotation marks, but we need to consider what this quotation means in the context in which it was written, okay? All men are created equal. Now, we need to think about what the Americans are defining here as all men, okay? In relation to race, then, slavery still existed. African Americans were excluded from voting. Now, when the Constitution was drawn up, and this is really, really interesting for you to get down, African Americans were not even considered humans. They were considered second-class citizens. In the Constitution itself, okay, it stated that African Americans were 3/5, 60% of a human. Okay. In relation to class, obviously there's different discrepancies in class depending on where they are located geographically. And that goes for region and national as well. So you might be able to sum up in a sentence whether the US was founded on the basis of equality. Right, thank you, year 13s.